All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar hosted by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. My name is Victor Trinidad with NCPMI. This webinar is part of the Implementation and Scale Up webinar series. Today's topic is Where Can We Start? State and local strategies for collecting and using data to eliminate the use of exclusionary discipline. Presented by Jennifer Shantz, Myrna Veguilla Figueroa, and Betsy Mercier. Thank you very much, and please proceed.
Great. Thanks, Victor, for introducing everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm Lisa Fox, and I direct the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. And I have an easy job today. I get to facilitate this panel of my colleagues from PMI and from the DaSy Center. What we're going to be talking about relates to a resource guide that we have posted with the webinar. So if you haven't looked at it yet, you may want to open it, go back there. You can go back to where you registered for the webinar, and we have that, the guide up, and many other resources related to this topic. So I hope that you get that, download it, and use that. So what we want to do today is kind of discuss this. Where do we start? It's really overwhelming to think about gathering data, yet I don't know a state and or a local early childhood system of care that isn't wanting to be able to work on this. And so this is a project that DaSy, ECTA, and NCPMI, and we have colleagues that worked on this very hard with us, who aren't here to be able to share. But so Jennifer, I want you to kind of start and talk about kind of why we felt like we three early childhood TA centers wanted to come together and work on a product like this.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. We are super excited to share the details of this new resource. And there we go. Thank you, Lisa. And I'll start with the why first. I mean, we all are on this call know the challenge that we have around exclusionary discipline in early care and education. The data are there. The data show us that, we've had an issue for many years. And we also, on the flip side, we have solutions. We have pyramid model, early childhood mental health consultation, that we know in programs that implement these practices that we see reductions in exclusionary discipline. We also know if we pay more attention to teacher and practitioner well-being, that we can get positive results at addressing exclusionary discipline. But collectively, we haven't had the big change we need to address this program across the states and across the country. I come from the DaSy Center, and so I think data are really important. And in our discussions with our colleagues at NCPMI and ECTA, we thought what a great opportunity it is to bring data to the center of these discussions and to help states and local programs use the data they already have and think about collecting new data, both quantitative and qualitative, to begin to address these issues, to raise more awareness about this issue and how it impacts families and practitioners, to begin to identify solutions and notice where we're getting some headway on these issues and how we can have conversations to improve the outcomes we want. We really view data as kind of the beginning point. I think some people think about data as like the end result, it's our outcome. But what we kind of want to flip that a little bit with this resource and advocate that data are just the starting point. It's the beginning of a deeper conversation around what's going on and how can we begin to address these issues.
Thanks, Jennifer. Betsy, I remember as we developed the guide, lots of conversation about this term exclusionary discipline. Do you want to share with the group some of the things we were talking about?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Betsy Mercier, also from the DaSy Center. Thrilled to be here today. Yes, so one challenge we found immediately when we thought about how to kind of center data around this question of exclusionary discipline is that there's no real shared definition of what we mean when we say exclusionary or suspension or expulsion. And we know that typically people think of expulsion as being the permanent removal of a child from a program and suspension referring to a temporary removal. But we also know that there's lots of reasons for removing a child from their setting and also lots of ways that programs might do that. And we know that different people may not always use the word suspension and expulsion to describe those kinds of removals. So we talked a lot about how do we know when exclusionary discipline is happening? Fortunately, for the guide we developed, we used the definition of exclusionary discipline provided by OSEP and the Office of Civil Rights in 2022. They released some very comprehensive guidance on exclusionary discipline. And that definition that guided our work is on the slide. The removal, whether on a short-term or long-term basis, of a child with a disability from a class, school, or other educational program or activity for violating a school rule or code of conduct. So this definition and the guidance from OSEP and OCR takes a very broad view of exclusionary discipline, including the use of what people call informal or soft expulsions and suspensions. Thank you. So this slide gives just a few examples of what soft expulsion and suspension in a program are, and these would be considered exclusionary discipline by the definition we use in the guide. So children being sent home early for having a difficult day is an example of a soft suspension. There may not be documentation, but the child is out of the school for part of the day. And then we have a couple examples of soft expulsion, which refers to creating conditions that make it really difficult for a child to continue in the program, even if they haven't been formally asked to leave. So this happens when programs require a family, for example, to pay for additional assistance in the classroom or encourage families to remove their child from the program. And I would also refer you to NCPMI's website, which has some great examples of these different types of expulsions and suspensions, which are really, really hard to identify and measure. So I think we'll have a chance to talk later about how you might collect data that capture some of these more informal forms of exclusionary discipline.
Great, thanks, Betsy. So I want to remind the audience you have a Q&A thingy, I don't know what to call it, where you can put your questions and we will get to the questions. I'm sure that you have them. I don't know if they're in the chat too, but we will spend some time on the questions you have. I'm already thinking of some. So Jennifer, we know that we need data to understand what's going on in our system, right? So if I want to work on this, yeah, that makes sense. I want to start with data to know what's going on, to help us from a state perspective, or maybe a local community, a community team is trying to work on this to inform policy or do preventions, all of those kinds of things. But it feels like a really monumental and overwhelming task. I know when I've talked to state teams, it's really hard to think about where do I start? And I'm sure community teams have the same experience. You want to share some wisdom there?
Sure, yeah, totally agree that it can feel really overwhelming to think about data, and your mind may go to like, well, we don't have that kind of data, and so we want you to put all of those concerns and fear. Some people just, even when the word data enters the conversation, get a little nervous. Just put those up on the shelf and check out our guide, because what we tried to do is create a really practical guide to walk you through some steps of how you could begin to go down this data road to explore and understand more what's happening either in your community, your program, or at the state level. And we'll walk you through this in more detail, but one of the first steps is really convening a team. And if you've done pyramid work or any implementation science work, you know that this is kind of one of our recommendations from the field, is that you should really have a leadership team that kind of guides the work like this. And we'll talk a little bit more about who you want to think about being on that team. But we also will, the guide will walk you through the data inquiry cycle that we use in DaSy, and that we've used with many of our partners in data conversations. And one of the very first steps that we're encouraging folks to take is, you know, we collect data all the time on so many different things for many different purposes. So rather than just running out there and collecting more data or identifying data, start with the questions you want to answer. What would be most helpful in your community or your program or in your state if you had the answer to that question? And it could be something as simple as, who is experiencing exclusionary discipline in early care and education in our state, in our community, in our program, you know, at whatever level you are. So just really starting with those questions as part of a leadership team is a really good starting place.
So do you want to talk more about the team? Who's on the leadership team that you recommend?
Yeah, so this shouldn't come to any surprise to those of us in early care and education. You know, we believe in the team approach at many different levels of the system, but we really are encouraging you to think broadly about your team. And it may be that you have an official leadership team, and you may need to be creative in terms of how you get different voices to have some influence with the team or be able to weigh in on different steps in the process. But members of your team might include families and practitioners who are really the ones kind of on the ground that are feeling the effects of exclusionary discipline. And so those voices need to be part of the discussion from the beginning, if possible, to form your questions that you're interested in. Clearly thinking about policymakers or the folks who have the power to make some changes with policy or guidance or data collection would really be important to include. And then thinking, of course, cross-sector in early care and education. So making sure you have the voices in terms of directors or leadership from childcare, Head Start, if your state has state-funded pre-K program, hearing from family childcare, as well as the early childhood programs under IDEA, both early childhood special ed and early intervention. I think we have a lot of resources, I think, across our TA centers around teaming. And in the guide, we point to several of those and really encourage you to look at those, because some of those, you know, it's not specific to this topic, but it's all relevant. One of the things we also did when we developed this resource was, you know, we knew there were lots of other resources out there that were relevant. And so we tried to pull those in and list them. And you'll notice at the back of the guide that there's a full list of different resources that we believe would be helpful to you. But there are several that talk about how to form a team and strategies to ensuring that your team is effective.
Great, that's super helpful. So we gather a team, and we've been talking about this could be a local cross-sector team, or maybe you're working on this at a state level. And we wish we knew from our audience members, and didn't look at those data before we got on here. But then I have a team, and we're going to have our first meeting. Kind of what do we do? So I think you have some information to share about the data inquiry cycle and how we can use that. And we have that posted as a resource.
Yep. So this is, if you haven't ever seen it, this we developed as part of our work on DaSy. And it really is a data inquiry cycle that can be used with any topic area when you want to take a close look at data. And one of the things I will say about it is you can really enter into the cycle at any point. It's a circle for a reason. You don't have to start in one place, because we know sometimes you have some data and maybe you want to start with the data analysis and interpretation. And again, it's really just about getting started and jumping in at a point that makes sense for where your community, your program, your state is. But I think in the guide, we kind of started with laying out the planning and design for data collection. And we're going to walk through each of these pieces as we move forward. So you start with planning and design for data collection, and that's where you really identify your questions. Then you move into, identifying the data you have, the data you need to answer those questions, and you determine, do we need to collect more data? If so, then you collect more data. And then you move into data analysis and interpretation, data reporting, dissemination, and taking action. I think one of the things that we hope you leave this webinar with is that in all stages of the data inquiry cycle, we really want to emphasize the importance of partnering with families, practitioners, communities to ensure that those voices are part of each phase, because they can really inform the next step that comes right after it, and will ultimately result in having meaningful data that you can take action on.
That's great. We're good on time. So could you give an example of that? Like what you just said, right? If they're in earlier, it has an impact of a later stage. Could you just unpack it a little bit more, Jennifer?
So for example, if, thinking about the question that you want to answer at the state level, or even at kind of the program administrative level, your understanding and perceptions of the issue comes from that lens. And that's a valid lens and really important lens, but it may be different than the family lens and the impact that families are experiencing. And so it's really important that as you begin to collect data and think about things, that you have all of those perspectives as you move forward. And so, for example, if your question is a really broad question around, we want to understand who's experiencing exclusionary discipline, and we just are relying on administrative data, and we have that, and we don't invite families to be part of those early discussions, you might miss out on really understanding what's happening in programs and what exclusionary discipline looks like for some subset of families. And so just being sure that is carried through. Another place we see this come up is on data analysis and interpretation, and really trying to unpack and understand your data. Having those different perspectives are really important in that realm as well, because what I perceive as a program administrator might be really different than a practitioner who's looking at the same data set and can tell you exactly why something looks the way it does. So I think that's the really important piece, to have those different voices when we're looking at data.
That's a great example. Thank you. Thanks for letting me ask you some additional questions. And I do want to remind people, I get to ask all the questions right now, but you also will have a turn to ask questions, and there's a little pod that you can put your questions in. As we worked with DaSy, we learned kind of this idea, we meaning, I in particular, as part of the group that worked on this, really learned more about this kind of systematic process of approaching this to build data collection and then do each of the functions of the cycle. And we talked about that a team would come together, probably in general, we want to do something about exclusionary discipline. And so their first question, if you start with the questions, might be, is it happening, and where is it, right? And to what extent is it happening? But Myrna, you want to walk us through kind of, there's a host of questions that could be of interest to the group that's working on this.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, that usually is the first question. Is it happening? And followed by how often is it happening? But, as you think about the data that you have, or the data that you want to gather, you really have to think about kind of that team, because that team is made up of very different individuals. They might all have different questions about different pieces, right? So you might have the community might want to know, are we experiencing in my community? Whereas the state might want to know across the entire state, and then knowing which communities are experiencing exclusionary discipline the most. You might also have questions about which children are experiencing exclusionary discipline, but those questions might then lead to wanting to know more about those children. So knowing what those questions are ahead of time are really important to sit down with that team and just think about what are these questions that we want to know. We want to know, is it happening? How often is it happening? Where is it happening in terms of if your state, is it by districts? Is it by communities? Is it by type of program? You might want to know those kinds of things. You might want to know more about the children, more about the practitioners. So you really, I mean, you can kind of go through this like data rabbit hole and come up with like so many questions about what you want to answer. But I think it's really important kind of at the get-go to sit down and think about what are those most important questions. Think about what are the ways you can collect that data, because some of the data might not be as easy to get, and it might take more planning. But those questions, by getting to those questions first and carefully planning that, I think you can then get into that. What do we need to collect? If you're interested in disproportionality in your state, what do we want to know? Do we want to know if it's occurring? The question of is is it occurring? Do we want to know how often it's occurring for a single child? Is it happening multiple times to children? Are they experiencing that multiple times? Or is it only happening to a child once? Like there's so many questions that you can kind of get into. And so being very clear about those questions will only help you make your data collection better. Because then you'll know exactly kind of what you want to collect to help answer those questions. And the guide really lays out what are those questions by like these bigger groups. So understanding about the experiences of children and families, understanding what strategies are currently being used. So those are all like really great ideas of what questions you could start with, followed by what type of data you can collect. And if you look at it a little bit closer, you might identify that there are pieces of data that can answer more than one question. So that's really nice too. And then the possible data sources. So the guide really does lay out a lot of questions that you can start off with. And then once you start analyzing, I think then you really get into that rabbit hole of more questions. You might leave with even more questions, to be honest.
Yeah, I thought that conversation that we all had as we built the guide was so fascinating, that broadening it not just to, we want to know who's suspending and expelling kids, right? And how often does that happen? And is it happening with disproportionality? Because those have been the headline things. But then knowing all this other stuff, and then that last piece that you just talked about, like, being able not only to think about the experience of children and families, but think about where is it happening and where isn't it happening, and who has support, right? Who's getting the infant and early childhood mental health consultation, or who's getting pyramid model implementation and who isn't, right? Those could be really important data elements for building a system that addresses the problem, which is what we want to do, right? We don't want to just unpack and admire it. We want to worry about it, but we want to be able to do something about it. Thanks, that was good. Sorry, an impromptu comment. Anybody else? You're welcome to chime in of the panelists. All right, so questions is where we start, and we do a big brainstorm about that. Betsy, I'm going to ask you the hardest question. It's like, we don't think we have a data system. Then what do we do?
Yeah, having that essential question is super helpful for beginning to like hone down something to a manageable process. But the other thing that's super helpful to talk about sort of before you even consider collecting data is to set some really specific parameters around your data collection, what you'll include, what you won't include, what's feasible and what's not feasible. We talked about definitions earlier, and it's important to define kind of how your team is conceptualizing exclusionary discipline. There may be some aspect of it that's most interesting to you. So just spend some time thinking and talking about a shared definition of what your project means when you say exclusionary discipline. And then it's really helpful to establish some, as I said, some parameters around your work. So what timeline are you looking at? Are you interested in data that go back a whole year? Are you interested in a year of data collection? Are you interested in trends over time? Like put some markers around the time frame that you're going to be looking at. And then there may be other kind of characteristics that you're interested in, particularly a particular geographic region or geographic regions. Maybe you're most interested in a particular type of program or a particular age of child that you're particularly interested in. So kind of come to agreement about what specifically you're going to do, and then you can let some of it go. You're not going to do all of it. We're not going to do all of it at once. So pick a few parameters that you're super interested in that will most directly speak to your question, and write it down. Document your decisions as a team and make sure everyone kind of understands what those parameters are. That's a really helpful way to kind of cut down on the overwhelm when there's so much that we're interested in and so much that we'd like to do. And you may have to get really detailed about which events you consider examples of exclusionary discipline. So understanding the reasons behind events. So was a child, maybe we know that a child was sent home from a program, but was that due to a tantrum or due to an illness? It'll be important to distinguish those kinds of things when you think about removals. So defining those parameters as a team before you even think about collecting data is a really good way to start. And our guide includes some links to some other resources that can help you think through some of the.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All right. There we go. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You're moving forward. Yeah. No, I was just mentioning that the guide includes a bunch of other resources that can help you with. You just have to make a ton of decisions around data collection so that you're really specific about what you're doing. And then once you kind of have your parameters in place, you can begin to discuss how you'll get the data you need to answer your question. And this slide just lists some considerations that you might have as a team. Starting with, as Myrna said, discussing the feasibility of collecting the data that will answer your question. And before you get into collecting data, you would want to identify any existing data that will help you to answer your question, including data sources that could be a proxy for exclusionary discipline, which we will talk about in a moment. And you can identify the data sources that you might need but don't seem to have access to, like kind of have those conversations and figure out what do we have, what's a nice to have, and then think about how you're going to get there.
Should I go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So this is kind of some bit of a list, right, about data sources.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time talking about, there's some kind of obvious data sources, but then we also spent a lot of time, because we know there's no sort of centralized place where we can find all the data we need on this topic. What are some other sources of data that we might consider? So we did a lot of brainstorming about that in developing the guide. Curious to hear if you have other ideas as well. One of the more obvious data sources is administrative data, such as attendance data and documentation of formal discipline citations. They may be available and give you a sense of the extent to which removals are happening. IEP, IFSP records and other service plans also may document sort of a systematic exclusion. For example, through a shortened school day. We had a colleague who worked with us on this who did a detailed study of IEPs, which really unveiled a lot of interesting information about kids leaving programs through their IEPs. It could also be helpful to know about programs' policies and procedures to understand what kinds of removals are permitted for a given program. We know there are variations in what different programs can and can't do in terms of exclusionary discipline. So some of that formal documentation could, add some interesting information to your work. And then thinking about available program level data, such as sign out sheets. So maybe parents are required to, when they sign their child out of school, they give a reason for doing so. Or there may be teacher logs that indicate, when children have been removed from a classroom. which gets at some of those reasons for removal that can be really hard to capture. And then we know that some programs require or encourage documentation of exclusionary disciplines. So for example, for preschool children who receive IDEA services, you may be able to access data on suspensions in public preschools through 618 data collections. And of course, pyramid model programs have behavior incident report data, which could provide a wealth of information. And we actually have worked with NCPMI on some separate guidance specifically for state teams on how BIR data could be used to answer the kinds of questions we're talking about today. So that's something you might check out. So those are some ideas about kind of using existing data or finding existing data that may get at some of the questions that you're asking. And of course, you can collect data to answer your specific questions. So you could do things like surveys or focus groups of parents and or educators, which could get at some really interesting data on the reasons behind the use of exclusionary discipline. And having access to parents and educators also kind of gives you the opportunity to ask directly how often children are sent home or sent out of the classroom and why, and sort of the impacts that has on families and on teachers. So the guide also provides, we have a kind of an example scenario of where you might find some hidden data around a specific question. I'm curious to know about other sources people may think of.
That's great. Did anyone on the panel, does anyone else, we'll take a minute pause, have anything you want to share about data collection questions or this idea? I know we talked about it for hours and hours.
Yeah, I think it's just don't be afraid to think outside the box and be a little creative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is a tough issue, and as Betsy said up front, like we don't have a definitive data source to rely on, and so we need some creativity to be able. And each state is unique and different, and every local community is different, and so just and again, this goes back to why the team is so important. Because someone who works in CCDF might have or know about a data source that if you're, working in Head Start, you don't know about. And so bringing the collective group together can really help brainstorm and be creative around how you get at trying to understand the issue in a data-based way. And qualitative data are data. So we like to, emphasize that again and again.
Yeah. Qualitative data really help get more at the why.
Mm-hmm.
We had a comment in the chat I noticed as well about parent training information centers that may be collecting exclusionary discipline data. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? A really important perspective. All right, please use the Q&A because we are moving close to having some time for you all to pose your questions about this. So Myrna, we've got all this data. This is what I often lean on you for with PMI and our work together, and give us the guidance around analysis interpretation. I have in my mind, one partner bringing their data that's different and constructed differently from another partner who has their data that's collected differently and might do different kind of measures. And where do we get started?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that when on the slide before about data collection sources. Your data collection source, if you are creating something new, it can be something simple. It doesn't have to be an online system or something that's very complex. So it can be something as simple as asking the question, as long as it's defined well. And then, is this happening? How often is it happening? Who is it happening to? So it doesn't have to be that complex. That's something to think about if you don't have an available data source and you need to think of something to use. Because the data analysis part, for me, is the fun part, being able to look at the data and being able to understand kind of that story, because, you know, obviously the data by itself don't really, um, they're not meaningful until you start to analyze it and interpret it. I love what you said, Jennifer, about the reminder of qualitative data, because we always say that qualitative data helps to tell that story. The data, quantitative data just gives you those numbers, but the qualitative kind of fill in those gaps. But the data analysis really, you're guided by your questions with your data analysis. So you've got to think about, you got to go back to those questions and say, okay, well, what did I want to know? Here's my data set. And especially thinking about that you might have many different data sets. So you'll want to make sure that, one, your data sets aren't, they're not, I completely lost the word, but that they're not, oh my gosh, that they're unique. You want to make sure that they're unique data sets. You want to make sure you're not counting things twice. So that's the first thing. What are the data sets that we have? Are they unique data? We also want to make sure that you're thinking about, you know, when you're thinking at the state level and you're looking at program level data, I think Betsy mentioned this earlier, making sure you get rid of the noise or other data that aren't important. If it's not answering your question, you don't really need that data. So really going back to that question, what was the data that I needed, and extracting that data from those data sets in a way that you can then analyze it in a meaningful way and interpret it. So that'll require you to aggregate data sets, disaggregate them again. It's kind of like this process where you're aggregating to answer this question, disaggregating to answer another question. So you want to know about across the state, you know, is it happening? You're going to aggregate all those sets together. Is it, who is it happening to? Disaggregate that data again. So you'll be able to identify patterns really across your entire data set. And then as you start looking at subgroups, and those subgroups really depend on what you're looking at to answer those questions, whether it's by a demographic characteristics of children, of practitioners, if you're looking at that type of data, if you are looking at the geographic regions that Betsy mentioned as well. So you'll be able to really come up with this clear picture as long as you've started collecting that data about what's happening in your state, what's happening in different communities, and answering all of those questions. And then being careful with interpretation, because definitely when we all look at data, we all come with our experiences, our lived experiences, our own lens. So how I interpret data a lot of times might be straight up the number, you know, versus Lisa, when she looks at data in such a beautiful way that she brings something else to it that I just may not have really seen. So making sure that when it gets to that point of looking at the data and understanding it, that you have a very diverse team that's looking at it, that they're looking at it and analyzing it together to understand what those patterns are and what's really happening, so that you can really come up with solutions. So I think that really is part of your analysis and interpretation. Won't get into what statistical methods you could use, because that is like, depends on what kind of data you have. And, you know, of course, you'll want to think about looking at other data sets, you know, that might help you with the data that you already have to kind of fill in those gaps. But really, this is that part that kind of does lead you, like I said earlier, into that rabbit hole, because you're going to see that as you start looking at that data, you're going to find that the team starts asking new questions. New questions start emerging, and either you might have the data for that you could go back and answer, or you might realize that, well, this is something we'll table now, but maybe in the future, this is something we want to start collecting data on. But really important to think about, you know, making sure that you're collecting the right data. And it's okay if you didn't. And I think that always happens too. Sometimes you think you're collecting the right data to answer those questions, and then you realize, oh, I get to that analysis part and I didn't really ask the right question. So really being careful about that and making sure that you give yourself grace for that and realize that it's okay. It's that circle, it's that cycle. You kind of just keep on going in and out of it until you kind of get to those answers that you're looking for.
Thank you. That was great. It's a lot, right? It's a lot. But I love that you kind of went back to the cycle because we can take comfort in the cycle, right? And that's part of the beauty of a team as well. All right, Jennifer. So then we have data and we've analyzed it. What do we do with it?
I just love taking comfort in the cycle. Like I just was gonna pause on that a moment. I think that's great. That's how we feel about it at DaSy, but we didn't know that, that comfort. But it's true. And I think it's, Myrna, hearing you talk too is also just that notion that beginning this inquiry at any point in the cycle, like it's the catalyst for new questions, new explorations. But until you start down this path and start looking at data, you don't know what you don't know. And so it can really generate rich discussions leaning towards solutions. So really, I think we would advocate that, it's only worthwhile to go down this road of looking at data and collecting data and analyzing data if, in fact, you are intending to share your findings. And we would argue that sharing your findings is really important. And even if your findings have some holes in them and they have elicited a whole new set of questions, that is very much still worthwhile to share with many different constituency groups. So those interested in this issue, policymakers, those again who may have the power to help you collect more data or identify more data sources or to answer additional questions. But being really systematic with how you're thinking about reporting and disseminating is really important, and being transparent about the data and your findings, and figuring out ways to clearly communicate with different audiences. And again, this is where that team is really important to develop a dissemination strategy that makes sense so that you can reach the various audiences. And it may be in the guide, we have some tips to think about how you do this. First of all, we connect you to our DaSy has we call it the Data Viz toolkit. It's all about how to visualize data in a really easy way to understand it. It's a great toolkit if you haven't seen it. It's kind of fun, and you can play around with how to really represent data in easy to understand ways, and really practical toolkit. But then thinking about how you might want to take action on data. So it may be that you want to do a root cause analysis to dig into the data deeper to figure out, are there differences or disparities happening in terms of who's experiencing exclusionary discipline practices? And then you can dig a little bit deeper into, well, why is that? What's going on here? You again want to bring in those different partner perspectives, including those who have the lived experience, both on the family and child, and what that feels like and looks like for families, and then with practitioners who are experiencing it on their end. Both perspectives are really valuable, and it will get to understanding the issue so we can get to some solutions. And hopefully the goal is that as we're digging into the data deeper and deeper and having these rich conversations, it's really gonna either put us back into the cycle to learn a little bit more, or hopefully we'll get to that place where Lisa talked about solutions. And again, that we want data on the solutions. So where is it not happening and why? And what can we learn from those programs, those communities who are addressing the disparities or addressing more broadly exclusionary discipline for young kids, and how can we learn from what has worked there and bring that to other communities or other programs. The other thing that the guide talks about, another resource that's another really popular one from DaSy, is our Look, Think, Act module, which really takes you through a process of once you have your data, how do you, it's a really standardized process of, and it works really well in doing it with a team to look at the data, to think about it, and then to figure out how you take action around it. So we encourage you to check out that resource too.
So we are going to move into questions, and we have one, but I'm hoping, or two, I'm hoping that there are also others. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can see the panelists. And so one of the questions for panelists that's out there is, could we address the issues of race and exclusionary discipline, and maybe share some of the conversation that we've had around that? I'm not quite sure, Candace, and if you want to offer more about specifics that you're interested in, but I know that it's something we've talked about quite extensively. Anybody want to start?
I'm happy to jump in. I think, clearly we know from the national data sets and sources that there are racial disparities around who experiences exclusionary discipline. And I think that definitely is something you could explore using this approach and this guide of really looking at wanting to understand, is that happening in our state, in our community? And that could be the question that your team starts with is, are there racial disparities in terms of who experiences exclusionary discipline? And then we would encourage the team to really look at solution-based approaches to understanding, like, well, if that's true and we have the data to support it, what do we do about it? So it's not just admiring the problem that we all know exists, but how do we, get out of that and encourage some solution-based approaches to addressing those disparities.
I don't know if y'all dug into the pod. So their concerns particularly about Black boys, and there is some significant evidence there that of disparities for Black boys and high rates of exclusionary discipline, and they're wondering about strategies. So understanding the problem is really important, and then beginning to address. I think if you haven't looked at pyramid model training materials, that there are quite a few around addressing bias. There's also an equity coaching guide, which is helping practitioners. So in pyramid model programs, when we know a particular pattern is happening, we believe that kind of helping people change their biases, if it really is about a particular set of practitioners or program that's doing that, that one place that you can work on that is through your coaching. And so we have a tool to help you have a lens on that, to have conversations about that, as well as some strategies, training strategies in general to be aware of. It could be around your policies, right? So once you begin to detect, as Myrna pointed out, the where it's happening, for whom it's happening, you also collecting that other administrative data that Betsy talked about, like, are there policies or procedures that are making that happen more often, and thinking about that. Anyone else have something around the racial? We have another question I can go to if you want. I will say one last thing. When we talk about it in this webinar, and the document is about exclusionary discipline, because one of our conversations is we don't want exclusionary discipline to happen. Kids who have problem behavior need to be in instruction and with support, right? Not sent out of the room or sent home, right? That's what they need. They're missing social emotional skills, behavioral skills. And so we want to stop exclusionary discipline. And of course, that raises issues about when it's happening with bias, then we need to be working on issues and concerns related to bias that happen in programs. So the other question is, do you have recommendations for how to gather data statewide when programs are so diverse? Public, private, home-based, ministry, And do we know of any states that have made headway on that?
I'm happy to take the first step, but so that question is actually one of the reasons we wanted to develop this tool and this resource, because we have heard a lot of interest from states in wanting to do that, but not quite sure where to start. You know, encouraging states or an individual in a state that is interested in getting started with a team, developing a state team that brings together all of those various programs at the state level to have a vision for it and get started on it.
Anybody else have a comment about that one?
Just that, again, like when you have different types of data and different sources of data, that process of kind of putting it all together and making sense of it, I guess I'm echoing what Jennifer said. It's that it really requires a lot of understanding, and that team, you know, that team is so critical for kind of trying to make sense of kind of very different types of data. What's nice about the data inquiry cycle is that once you start, it's a little bit addictive. So like when you do get those additional questions, you're kind of anxious to start it again. And that's a really complex scenario that would require, you know, a lot of interesting and fun conversations with your team, but challenging question.
I think the only thing that I would add is just making sure that, and this was, I think Jennifer, or Betsy, you talked about this, was that making sure that those programs have that common definition of what those practices are, so that when they do gather data, that they are all gathering the same type of data, so that it's quality data when it gets up to the state level. So making sure there's a clear understanding, what does that look like? Public, private, home-based ministry. This is what it looks like. These are the examples, so that that data is being collected accurately.
I'm glad you brought that up, Myrna, because when we worked with some states that were interested in this, they were kind of way down the path and realized then they didn't have shared definitions, right? And that's a lot of work to come up with shared definitions and then look at the data and see if they inform those shared definitions. And that could be a really important starting point. Has there been data to compare the rates of exclusionary discipline between neurotypical children versus children with known and documented disabilities? So there are data in the OCR data collection that show disparities for children with IEPs, preschoolers with IEPs, experiencing suspensions and expulsion disproportionate to children without disabilities. I think that's where we're going with that. Any other reflections or noted data reports that have shown that?
I think that's the primary one. I was just looking in our guide. I think we have a link to the OCR data and reports at the back of the guide, which is where that data would exist. I mean, one of the things would be interesting is if any states have looked at that with their data, because we do know that at the federal level, we don't have that data for preschoolers with disabilities. At the federal level, they're not able to pull out the 3 through 5 year olds served to see what their rate of exclusionary discipline is and compare that to a national, at the national level, to kids without disabilities. So I think that would be a really interesting one if a state was interested in exploring that a little bit more.
All right, we're at our time. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Victor. He'll tell you how to evaluate. And this webinar was recorded, will be posted. So if you want to share it with others and found it valuable, and all the resources will still be there.
Thank you so very much to our panelists for their wonderful insights. Your feedback is very important to the work that we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and more. Thank you to our funder for making this webinar possible. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.